Hi, this is Amy Fowler, Deputy Secretary for the State of Vermont Agency of Education, and this is the second part in a presentation to help the public understand a report we are writing about equal access to high-quality educators. As previously mentioned, one of the requirements of this report is that we identify equity gaps. We need to compare our schools in two ways. First, our schools with high proportions of students who are poor, as determined by free and reduced lunch population, compared to schools that are considered more wealthy, where they have fewer students on free and reduced lunch. We also need to compare our high minority schools to our low minority schools. And when we do that, we have to look at least three characteristics: inexperienced educators, unqualified educators, and out-of-field teachers. I'll be talking about each of those in just a moment. In order to make these comparisons, one of the things we needed to do was group our schools. So we started off by imagining, for example, that we might have 20 schools in Vermont, and we started by first identifying what percentage of free and reduced lunch students each school had. And whichever school had the fewest number of students, 0% on free and reduced lunch, came into one corner. The next highest percent at 2% came next, and then the remaining were all set in an array so that we went from the lowest percentage of students on free and reduced lunch all the way up to the highest percentage. And then as the case to identify the quartile, the middle group actually is left out of the analysis, and we're able to compare the 25% of schools that have the lowest poverty to the 25% of schools that have the highest poverty. And so this is what our analysis is comparing, those with the lowest poverty to the highest poverty. It's important to understand that when we look at the data, we're looking at disadvantages, the things that we expect to see as negatives for a population. And based on the national research, what we would expect to see is that high minority schools will have a lot of red. They'll have a lot of disadvantages compared to schools that have low minority populations. We also expect to see that schools with higher levels of poverty will have a lot of red compared to schools that have low poverty. Now we're going to look at the data. So first, we're looking at teacher characteristics in our high minority compared to our low minority school. The first criteria is first-year teachers. Research shows that first-year teachers on average are not as successful in student outcomes as more experienced teachers, but most importantly, first-year teachers get better over time, and we want to hold on to those teachers for as long as we can. Well, here our data in Vermont does not match the national trend. Students in our high minority schools have first-year teachers about 3.5% of the time. However, in low minority schools, that is a 6.3% rate of new teachers, of first-year teachers. In other words, the disadvantage is in the low minority schools. For teachers who are not highly qualified, these are teachers who meet the minimum requirements for teaching a particular subject, but possibly have not yet passed the exams that are required for full licensure. Again, we see the disadvantage is falling with our low minority schools, while high minority schools have a lower percentage of teachers in that position. We also have something in Vermont called a provisional license. This is often awarded to someone who has a license in one area but is being asked to teach a second area. Again, we see that the disadvantage is with the low minority schools, but overall there aren't very many people that are teaching under a provisional license. Some people asked us to look at the salary for teachers, thinking that teachers in low minority schools might be paid differently than high minority schools. And it turns out that's true. In a low minority school, teachers are paid on average about $3,000 less per year. And when we look at that same figure and we also consider the size of the classes they teach, teachers in low minority schools are paid approximately $370 less a year for every student they teach. So in conclusion, when we look at our teacher characteristics, Vermont's high minority schools are not disadvantaged in terms of their access to teachers who are of high quality. We then turned our attention to principals in these same schools because we wanted to know if there was any connection between our principal attributes and high and low minority schools. First, we looked at the number of principals that have been in each school over the last 5 years. And again, here, the disadvantages with low minority schools. They have more principals in 5 years than our high minority schools. And this is the opposite of what we'd expect. When we looked at salary, again, the disadvantage is for the low minority schools. They're paid approximately $8,000 less a year than our high minority schools. But when we look at this adjusted by the number of students they serve, we see that high minority schools principals are at a disadvantage there. One reason for this finding is that high minority schools tend to be larger, and they also tend to have assistant principals who help with the workload. So on most characteristics, we see again that Vermont's high minority schools are not disadvantaged in their access to high quality principals. Turning our attention then to teachers in poverty settings, high poverty compared to wealthy schools, we'll look at the same characteristics. For exposure to first-year teachers, we see that in our schools with high poverty, they're nearly twice as often, at almost 6%, to have a first-year teacher compared to our wealthy schools. Our teachers who are not highly qualified, this is nearly identical, with a slight disadvantage for our high poverty schools. Our teachers on a provisional license between our high poverty and wealthy schools, in actuality, our high wealth schools see more provisional licenses, but again, this is a very close comparison. When we look at the adjusted salary, the advantage goes to the wealthy schools where teachers are paid approximately $1,000 more a year. And when we look by student, we can also see that the wealthy schools are paid a bit more per student than the high poverty schools, about $350 a year. So interestingly, on most teacher characteristics, Vermont's schools with high poverty are disadvantaged in the same way that other schools across the nation see that disadvantage. Turning our attention to principals, we can see that for the principals in the poverty comparison, using the exact same metrics, the number of principals in the last 5 years is nearly identical, with a slight disadvantage for the poor schools at 2 principals for every 5 years. The adjusted principal salary is actually lower in our high poverty schools, almost $7,000 less per year. And when we look at the per student ratio, the disadvantage here is actually with our more wealthy schools, it's about $50 per year for the principal. So in this case, in most principal characteristics, again, we see that our schools are disadvantaged in their access, but it is not a very large disadvantage. So overall, when we looked at the data, it appeared to us that the most significant equity gap that we had was in exposure to first-year teachers. And so as a reminder, the overall statewide, it was 6% for our high poverty schools compared to 3% for our wealthy schools. In other words, the gap is twice as large between our poor and our wealthy schools. But we wondered if this was actually the case between all of our locations. So we looked at the federal definition for what constitutes a city or a suburb, and these are all the areas near our city of Burlington. And what we found here is that the difference between our high poverty schools and our high wealth schools is very small. In fact, it's nearly equivalent, and in both cases, it's a better exposure rate than it is for the state as a whole. In our towns, which is any larger settlement outside of the Burlington area, we see the gap is nearly 3 times as large between our high poverty schools and our wealthy schools, and it's worse than the state overall. In our rural settings where we don't have towns, the gap matches what we see at the statewide average, which makes sense because most of our schools are rural schools. So in total, what we found as our results is that overall in the state, we do not have educator equity gaps related to minority status of students, but we do see that our schools with higher rates of poverty tend to be on the disadvantaged side on most indicators. However, the only one that is of significance is exposure to first-year teachers, and that's really differs depending on where you live, with towns and rural settings having a greater gap related to first-year teachers. Thank you.